Hi everyone, I'm Territorial from the Evolution and Ecology Research Centre at UNSW in Sydney. So if we look in nature, we see a variety of different forms of animal communication, and I've got some examples here up on the screen. And we're often very interested in what could be driving the complexity in animal communication. This complexity can take a variety of forms, but it can include the addition of new components to a signal repertoire. For example, the evolution of new notes or a new call type that accompanies other signals in birds or frogs or anything else that communicates using acoustics. And there's a variety of complexity and a whole host of modalities, from electric signals in fish, ornaments and visual displays in lizards, and, for example, the stotting of gazelles. But in general, we've been focused on the evolution of gains rather than losses of complexity. Now, for the last decade or so, we've been studying the Southeast Asian Draco lizards. Now, these guys are just awesome for a variety of reasons, but one of them will be that they're very evocative because they're gliding lizards. And we've got some images up here on the screen that illustrates that. So they have an adaptation to their rib cage. That means they can use their rib cage, extend it out as a wing, and they're extremely agile with gliding through their arboreal habitats. Now, we've looked at the evolution of this gliding in these lizards before, and I've got the publication citation up on the screen here. But what I want to talk to you about is the other reason why Draco are really awesome. They have a set of visual displays that males in particular use to advertise territorial ownership. They're trying to monopolize territory which overlaps the home ranges of females to try and monopolize access to those females. Males spend a lot of time doing these visual displays. Now, these visual displays, I'll show you examples in just a moment, are centered on the performance of a head bob and push-up, which is not unusual for lizards. But what is unusual, they've evolved this dewlap, this throat fan, this large, colourful, often patterned ornament, which they flick out as part of the head bob display. There's a lot of diversity in species and a lot of diversity in the way they put these movements together, and a lot of diversity in the habitat that these species occupy. Now, over 10 years worth of work, 10 plus years worth of work, as you can imagine, we've got a really large inventory of data, which includes hours of HD video of thousands of territorial visual displays recorded in the field for hundreds of miles across many different species. We've actually gone to the effort of catching these animals as well. I won't go into the detail about how difficult it is to catch Draco, but we can do it. And we do it because we're also to take morphological measurements, things as basic as body size and body length, but also we can measure the color morphology of these lizards, in particular that dewlap. And of course, because these species are living in a variety of different habitats, we're also making a point of collecting data on environmental variables, in particular habitat light and the amount of visual noise that is occurring in the environment through wind-blown vegetation, both of which we know are really important for the detection of visual displays in general, but visual displays in particular in lizards. So, as you can see from this video, this is a single species. You'll see a series of different males of the same species. The dewlap color is not going to vary. And you can see that they start off with this head bob or this push-up, which is typical for both agamid lizards, but also iguanid lizards, things like anoles and fence lizards. So that's not unusual, but the unusual thing is the evolution of this large throat fan or dewlap. So it's really interesting. You can spend hours watching these guys and they spend a lot of time performing these displays. But we were surprised to find that there are a bunch of Draco species that don't do the head bob, and they focus entirely on the extension of that dewlap. This video sequence is again of a single species. It's the same color dewlap in every example for the male. But the point is, it just shows you that signal effort is entirely all about that dewlap. They don't do the head bobs, which is really unusual. And I'll show you how unusual that is when we compile our data and we map the evolutionary history through ancestor state reconstructions. Now, it doesn't matter what the type of program or method you use for these ancestor reconstructions, the outcome is the same. It's just the presence of head bobs included in the repertoire and the extension of a dewlap. what we can see here is that if we include a whole host of other gametes through published sources and direct observation, we see that the evolution of hedbobs, like I said, is common. It's basically uniform or generic across this family. It has a very ancient origin. We can put a number there if you want, 140 million years. Yeah, why not? It's ancient. That's the point. And only in Draco have they also evolved the evolution of this dewlap to elaborate those hedbob movements, to increase the complexity of that repertoire. But the chocolate brown here is those species, I should say, that have lost the hedbob and focus entirely on the extension of that dewlap. So in general, it's this large single clade that have lost the use of this hedbob. So this is what I was really interested in trying to figure out. What could cause the loss of a hedbob or a whole signal component that's very complex from the repertoire of these visual displays? Now, I imagine you can actually come up with some hypotheses straight away, and I'll bet you one of those is probably something to do with relaxed selection. This is a scenario that those species that don't have the hedbobs basically don't have a lot of pressure for advertising territorial ownership. Perhaps they're not even territorial anymore because there isn't that pressure from the social environment to compete for territories or females. The other one is this adaptive constraint, which is a really awkward phrase, and I hate it. I couldn't come up with anything else, but basically it's species living in very difficult visual environments where the subtle movements of the hedbobs are just not functional anymore because they just can't be seen. So these species are forced to focus all their signal effort on the extension of that more conspicuous dewlap. Now, I won't go into the detail about the data collection or the data that's on the screen here, but it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, there is no difference in the social environment in terms of the number of rival males competing for the same territory or the number of females that might be observing a male's visual displays. And there's also a difference in the environment in terms of light or the amount of visual noise. So species that have lost their hedbobs, focus entirely on the dewlaps, don't live in social or environment or physical environments that are any different to any of the other Draco. So that's not the selective cause for the loss of the hedbobs. Now, there is this notion that because hedbobs, you're physically moving mass, the larger you are as a species, the more costly it is to move that body mass. Now, push-ups, and if you do push-ups as part of your exercise routine, you'll know that it's physically strenuous. So the idea here is that the cost of performing hedbobs has now outweighed the benefits of including those into the visual display repertoire for those species that are large, and that's caused the loss of these hedbobs. Now, before I get into the results, I just want to quickly explain how this analysis was done. It's a phylogenetic comparative method called AOE. It essentially just models phenotypic evolution onto a tree. I've run a Mickey Mouse simulation here just to give you an idea on how this kind of works. And the analysis spits out various parameters that people interpret as the strength of selection or the amount of stochastic genetic drift in the evolutionary process. But the main thing to focus on is what we're saying here is there should be a different adaptive optima between species that have lost their hedbobs compared to the ones that have retained them from their evolutionary ancestors. All it really is at the end of the day, and I know the comparative analysis people are going to freak out when I say this, but it's just a really fancy phylogenetic ANOVA, all right? So for those of you who are not familiar with it, just think fancy phylogenetic ANOVA. So with our fancy phylogenetic ANOVA, we do find evidence that the species that have lost their hedbobs, focuses entirely on the extension of the dewlap, are on average a lot larger than the rest of the Draco. So again, this implies there might actually be a greater cost with hedbobs the larger you get as a species, and as a consequence, large species have subsequently lost the use of the hedbobs. But what are the consequences? If you drop a whole component from your visual display repertoire, you're losing a lot of potential information as a consequence. So one of the obvious things would be that they make up for that loss of potential information in the dewlap. And they do this by increasing the color complexity in terms of the number of colors and the patterning of that dewlap when they lose their hedbobs. Now, I won't go into detail again about how we measure complexity and color. We've used this technique before. We've published on it recently in behavioral ecology. Do check it out if you're interested in it. But again, it's just this notion that if you lose the head bob, these species are now increasing the complexity of the color and the patterning of the dewlap to make up for that loss of potential, information potential. And when we apply our fancy phylogenetic ANOVA, we do find strong evidence that those species that have lost their head bobs do on average have a lot more color complexity in those dewlaps, which again really does suggest that they're making up for the loss of information potential because they're no longer doing head bobs by increasing or packing more complexity into that dewlap. So it seems that the potential cause could be something to do with body size and the cost of physical movement in head bobs for larger species, and that's caused the loss of the head bob. And the consequence seems to be that they have then packed in the information potential in that dewlap itself. So they're making up or compensating for the loss of the head bobs as a consequence, which kind of makes sense. So again, we've got a really rich literature on animal communication and the evolution of its complexity, but we've been focused primarily on increases or gains in complexity. But losses in complexity occur in nature too, and relatively commonly as well. But knowing why those species lose complexity is really important to obtain a full view of the selection processes involved in signal evolution. So with that, I just want to thank my collaborators over the last decade, my students and my local collaborators in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Borneo. If you've got any other ideas about why these lizards might have lost head bobs, please do reach out to me, send me an email and let me know, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you'd like to check out some of the publications that we've put out on communication and gliding in these wonderful lizards, check out our research page as well. And thank you for watching this talk.